Alrighty. Turn the lapel mic down a little. All right. Welcome back. Apologies again for missing last Thursday's class and taking a little while to get slides up. Really wasn't feeling well last week, and found this weird piece of cloth in my pocket. Okay. Ended up, in the emergency department. So I do apologize, and hopefully not too much of an inconvenience. Okay, so I guess a couple of things just to mention really quickly, right? So obviously I posted on Friday, a little bit late, and I do apologize for that. A lecture that covers kind of the first two parts in Stark's The Rise of Christianity. We're going to keep going today. We're going to talk about the role of women in particular, and then a few other things, and kind of keep going from there. We should have no problem getting through that, by the end of everything by the end of Thursday's class. And that'll take us up to the content for midterm number 2. Midterm number 2 is on Tuesday of next week, right? So it is next week on March 10th. I believe it is the 10th. Yes, if the calendar in my brain is correct, it is in fact the 10th. So I will break that down for you next class because honestly, bit of a schmozzle. Haven't had a chance to really look at the exam. To remember what is on it specifically, but I'll give you a really good breakdown of it on Thursday so that you have that over the weekend in order to look it over. Okay, I feel bad. I love introducing this book. This is one of my, we go back to the Rise of Christianity. I this year and last year, I think I got sick both times when it was time to introduce it, which really sucks. Because I really love this book. It's a really, I would say this is, in terms of sociology, this is a classic, an underappreciated one. I think that a lot of, so-called sociologists aren't even entirely aware of, but it is one of the most interesting books in sociology of religion. And really interesting if you want to understand how a new religion movement gets its legs. And yes, it is about the rise of Christianity very specifically in antiquity, but a lot of the general principles that Stark kind of elucidates apply to a lot of other new religious movements, right? And just because I was, I had a few minutes the other day, I was Googling Rodney Stark's obituary, because, that's a perfectly normal thing to do. On a Monday afternoon, but I was. And I love the title of this particular one. That was from Washington University. Was they called him a reckless eclectic, which honestly might be my favorite description of anyone ever. That he's just a reckless eclectic. And if you know his body of work, you kind of get it because he dabbled across so many different disciplines, overturned apple carts, and really got in people's faces. And this book is no exception to that, right? Unfortunately, I can't move exams. Once the exams are in the syllabus, they are unmovable because everybody plans their lives around exams, and trust me, there are so many times when I'm like, man, I would love to get one more unit on this exam to balance it out a little bit differently, but unfortunately I cannot move exams. If however you have some reason, some overload or something, do get in touch, right? You have 6 exams that day or something crazy, get in touch and we can talk about making an exception or bumping in a date or something like that, but I can't do a whole class bump because honestly, it makes everyone's lives crazy because if I bump it, because you have 3 exams that day and I bump it to Thursday, well then Jasmine has 3 exams on Thursday and now it messes up her life and everything kind of goes kooky. So the dates are fixed, but with possible exceptions, but again, on a case-by-case basis, and, has to be a good reason. Yes, I can do that, but as I said 2 seconds ago, I'm going to do that on Thursday. But I mean, I will tell you straight up, we've covered 2 topics, or will have covered 2 topics. No. I will do that on Thursday. Because, as I may have mentioned a moment ago, I am not ready, and I would be, freeballing it a little bit and not 100%. And I mean, I could pull up the questions and look at them, and then only the people in class could see them, and everyone who didn't show up would not see in advance what the questions are. But I feel like that wouldn't be fair either. Although everyone in class seems to be okay with it, but whatever. No, I will do that on Thursday, I promise. I just need a little bit of prep time to sort of like look through the questions, make sure they're all good still, and just kind of get a sense. Like, honestly, I haven't necessarily looked at these questions in a year, so I always go over them before to make sure that they are still workable, they're still sort of vaguely AI resistant somehow. And I will tell you all of this on Thursday. I do promise. No, I'm kidding. I will show you practice questions. I was going to pull up the actual questions, because I could go and pull up the actual bank, but because of the way OBS works, I would have to change what window I'm looking at, so I never do that. So only the people actually in class would have seen those things. So I'm just kidding. I hate you. No, I will live stream everything, examples, all that jazz on Thursday. I am just not ready. I promise I'll be ready on Thursday. Probably, maybe, if I'm really good, and nothing terrible happens. Okay, but yes, I will just say, honestly, the bulk of the content, with some references back to other parts of the course, right? So the theories from part 1 is going to be our theories of secularization, right? And we got a bunch. And the rise of Christianity, right? And the rise of Christianity has a whole bunch of different parts to it, but those are the 2 topics that are going to be on the midterm. So no surprises, I promise. Surprising, totally new topic you've never seen on the midterm. What, you didn't read the entire book and subparagraph 4, that footnote on page 63? Too bad, you failed. No, I'm kidding. Never would do that. Okay, so I'm just going to recap really quickly what was in sort of the lectures that were online. So Stark is making a kind of a general argument in this book about what led to the rise of Christianity. Actually, I'm going to do like fast forward version so I can get my head back into it, even though I looked at these like an hour ago. Right, and very specifically, he is making an argument against the traditional kind of narratives that have prevailed amongst historians and largely amongst sociologists about what led to Christianity's explosive growth, right? From this marginal, barely existent sect of Judaism to the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, by the time we hit really the end of the 4th century. So, basically, it's against this whole idea that Constantine was the true founder of Christianity, right? And the only reason that Christianity ever thrived was because of Constantine. And he's arguing against this. And he does this in a couple of ways, right? So one is by looking at, basically an argument of how new religious movements tend to grow and whether it would be possible that Christianity could have basically grown to roughly half the population of the Roman Empire by the middle part of the 4th century, just based on, what we know about other new religious movements. And he basically says yes, right? And he puts this rate, again, I'm doing this really quick. He says that, a rate of 40% increase per decade makes a lot of sense. Any lower or higher And basically, you either have a religion that's not big enough or way too big by the time we hit 350. And he says this is really consistent with the growth rate of other new religious movements, particularly the one that we know that has kind of most recently turned into a global religion, which is, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormons. All right, so amongst the really, and I think really provocative things that Stark wants to do is suggest that we don't actually need extraordinary explanations for the rise of Christianity. Normal sociological processes can explain how Christianity became so big and so dominant, right? Okay, and again, I'm doing this really, really, really fast. So I won't go through all of these, but very specifically, he's against the thesis of mass conversions, right? That you need mass conversions in order to, get Christianity to basically the size it should be by the middle part of the 4th century. Oh, I wish I had taught you this. This is one of my favorite slides in the entire course. I love this one. Right? Sadness. Because he did work with the Moonies, and I know you listened to this on the recording, but I love the Moonies, and I love his study of the Moonies and hanging out with them. What I really love about the Moonies study and Stark is basically this notion that why people come to new religions is not so much because of the beliefs, right? Because the Moonies introduced all sorts of beliefs, they held conferences and all sorts of things. It's because you make social bonds with people in the religion, right? And that's what Stark and Laughlin found in their study of the Moonies, right? They went and hung out with them and they said, well, converts will stress the beauty and profundity of doctrines. Most early on, when they started hanging out with the Moonies, said they were uninterested in religion prior to that time, right? Or they were uninterested at the beginning of the process. So, trying to spread your religion by street preaching or by going door to door like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses do is relatively ineffective, right? It's way, Stark puts it at less than 1 in 1,000 people that are visited actually convert. Where you do get converts is where people form interpersonal attachments. And this is the math, so I'm just going to highlight it really quickly. Interpersonal attachments to people inside the group overpower their attachment to people outside the group. And I know I've said this before, but, that's the magic of conversion, right? Conversion happens when your connections inside a group outweigh your connections outside the group. Okay, and yeah, I love this. Conversion is not about seeking to embrace an ideology. It's about bringing one's religious behavior into alignment with that of friends and families, right? So this works with recruits to new religious movements, right? It almost always starts among close friends and family of the founder and then spreads through interpersonal ties from there. And I think, we can presumably say this holds with deconversion as well. People who are hanging out with a bunch of people who are irreligious are likely to bring their beliefs into alignment as well. Okay, so yeah, unlikely that street preaching in late antiquity led to the rise of Christianity. Okay, I do want to just highlight this again really quickly for 2 seconds, because again, Stark takes a shot at deprivation theory specifically, and this idea that basically the people who joined Christianity early must have been the poor or the lower classes to which, Christianity's idea of, recompense in the afterlife was really appealing. But actually what we see is that it was particularly appealing to the middle class. And there are lots of rich benefactors in the early church, including, the wives of important Roman officials who intervene on behalf of Christians to stop their persecution, because presumably they themselves were Christian, right? So, all right. How are conversions and discovering and joining a religion different in this context? Are they? Well, converting would be basically, that was not the flavor of tea I thought I had. It's better once you're expecting it. It's like one time at Costco, I filled my cup with iced tea, but I thought it was root beer. And then I sipped the iced tea and I almost threw up because I thought there was something wrong with the root beer. So yes. Sorry, I just saw that. I saw that comment. This cult making tutorial sucks. You expect me to make friends? Yes, weirdly. Cult leaders are almost always super charismatic, right? Weird as it may seem, they are very charismatic. Okay, this cult making tutorial, is that what sociology of religion is for you? But yes, stay tuned for more helpful cult making tips. Those are coming up. How is conversion and discovering and joining a religion? I mean, here, right, when we're thinking about conversion, right, this is where a person, we'll talk about primary and secondary conversion in a sec. I have the definitions there. So maybe let's wait here, actually. Let's hold on to your question, and we'll come back to it. I'll try not to erase it this time, because I do that sometimes. Okay, really quickly speed run through this, right? Again, just because I'm getting my brain situated. One of the other really provocative claims that Stark makes is that particularly the plagues, right? So the plague of 165, oops, I have a highlighter, I thought it was a pen, and the plague of 251 that both hit the empire probably contributed to the growth of Christianity in really, really weird ways. And he's got his 3 theses, right? And pay attention to these, right? Because, you know, they're good little testable tidbits. So the 3 things, right? The plagues, Greco-Roman religion had a hard time explaining those plagues. Christians, because of the social structure that they created within Christianity, were better able to cope. So they had a higher survival rate than the pagans, right? Which means afterwards they made up a greater proportion. And because the epidemics destroyed pagan to pagan social networks, it shifted a lot of social networks so that it included more Christians, which led to more conversions, right? Which is fun. Do cults recruit people on dating apps? That is a new one to me. My boyfriend's cousin saw some interesting group cult looking person looking to make friends. You know, maybe. I've never thought about that. You know, now I have to do some research. Now you've asked a question. Okay. Again, I don't want to go through everything. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things, right? And again, the idea, one of the big things that Stark talks about is the fact that likely after the plagues, right, you would have had a considerable or a considerably greater chance of pagans bonding with Christians, like making social connections with Christians, because they had non-intact social networks, because so many of them had died or fled, that it would have led people to connect with Christians. And when people connect with religious people, the chance that they'll convert increases significantly. Okay, let's talk about women, because the story of women that Starks tells is a really, really interesting one, because he thinks that women actually were fundamental in the growth of Christianity. Okay, so widely acknowledged historical fact. Women were a really big proportion of the early Christian population, right? And this, I think, often sort of goes against perhaps our modern sensibilities in some ways. But what Stark says, and again, when you see it, you'll kind of understand what I mean. What Stark says is that Christianity offered a relatively high status to women compared to their relatively low status in Roman society, right? That basically women are not particularly well treated in Roman society. Outside of the nobility, right, they're largely considered chattel property. You know, even within the nobility, right, the citizen class, you know, and the senatorial class, women are largely seen, you know, in most cases as goods to be disposed of, especially for making favorable alliances, right? You know, so very famously, you know, Julius Caesar is married to his wife specifically not for any particular reason other than to make an alliance with a powerful, another powerful family in Rome, right? And this is really, really common. Now, amongst, say, non-citizens, the kind of plebeian and then the slave classes, women are pretty widely abused. They're mistreated in lots of ways. But as we'll see kind of here, you know, the lives of girls and women were not treated as anything of particular value by Roman society. Okay, now he makes the case that, you know, this likely is due to, at least partially, to skewed sex ratios, right? Where there was a, shall we say, not enough women. And we'll talk about why there's not enough women in some detail, but there's fewer women than men in Roman society. And basically, what we typically see in societies where women are outnumbered by men is, you know, we'll talk about this in a second, but they're treated as a scarce good. And that actually doesn't lead to them being treated better. In some ways, it actually leads to them being treated worse. Okay, so skewed sex ratios are for lots of reasons. Abortion, typically, you know, failed abortions. At a certain point, the Romans had a, you know, it sounds weird for the ancient world, but the Romans had quite a fertility crisis ongoing, and a lot of Roman families didn't want a lot of children, right? Again, children consuming a lot of resources. So when someone got pregnant, right, they would often attempt to induce an abortion by, you know, either physical means, which commonly led to infection, or by how shall we put it, pharmaceutical means, which meant administering, you know, a small dose of a poison. But poisons are super hard to manage, right? If you don't know what you're doing, it's super easy to poison someone accidentally. So lots of women died from that. Girls were commonly the victims of infanticide, you know, in ways that often Roman or historians of the Roman Empire refer to them as supernumerary infants, right, or extra babies. If they were girls, they were seen as of lower value, and they were often killed or at very least exposed to the elements, right? So they would be taken outside the city and left like out in the forest to die, right? To be consumed by, to die of exposure and be consumed by wild animals. And of course, you know, because it's pre-modern medicine, a lot of women died in childbirth. So what Stark suggests is that the ratio of men to women may have been as skewed as somewhere around 133 men for every 100 women, right? So, you know, basically 33 men who probably could never hope to get a wife or get married or any of those things. And yeah, some of the societies that we have today that are very male skewed, usually because of sex selective abortions, places like the People's Republic of China, you know, has a ratio somewhere around between 110 males to 100 females, or about 115, depends on which numbers you use. But basically, that is considered by modern standards a very skewed sex ratio, and that itself is having a lot of demographic impacts on Chinese society. Okay, so Christian women had relatively high status in their communities versus relatively low status for pagan women, which Stark suggests led to Christians having an amplified ability to over-recruit women. And that, he thinks, then led to what he calls secondary conversions. Okay, so we do have lots of kind of textual and historical evidence for Stark's proposition, right? So textual evidence from the New Testament, right, specifically the letter to the Romans, suggests a relatively skewed sex ratio, as does archaeological evidence from North Africa, right? And North Africa, you know, in the early, kind of in late antiquity, would have been the hotbed of Christianity, right? So Egypt, Libya, those two in particular would have had pretty large and pretty vibrant Christian communities. And when you look, one of the things that Stark suggests is when you look at things like, they made things like lists of donations and goods that were being donated by the church to help people around them. You had an overabundance of women's clothes in particular, suggesting that there were more women who had clothes to give, meaning they were a bigger part of that community. When we see in Romans, right, one of the pieces of evidence is we have very prominent female members, Prisca and Phoebe, that are cited by Paul in his letter as people that in particular helped Paul on his many travels. And I can't remember if it's Romans or a different letter. It's escaping me now. But he commends, I'm pretty sure it's Phoebe as a deaconess. And it's highly likely that, because Paul was sending his letter, and most historians sort of think this, because Paul was sending his letters to be read to these churches by other people, that it may have been, a woman who was actually reading it to the church community in Rome, and probably Phoebe in particular. Okay, so writers of kind of both the New Testament period and the kind of early church period sort of take it as self-evident that women outnumber men, and that this is kind of a problem, that women were converting to Christianity in relatively large numbers. Okay, so, and maybe this is back to that question that is here. Oh, that's a good question. I'll answer that in a sec. Okay, so primary conversion. In primary conversion, the convert takes an active role in his or her own conversion, right? So they becoming a committed adherent based on a positive evaluation of the particular faith. And now, bracket that, albeit attachment to members plays a major role in the formation of that positive evaluation, right? So remember, rational choice theory from way back at the beginning of the course, right? This is sort of the argument that Stark is making here. Primary conversion happens, basically on the basis of a rational choice that a convert makes about the particular religion in question, based on their evaluation of it, and a lot of that evaluation is based on their interaction with members, right? Now, secondary conversion is more passive and involves somewhat reluctant acceptance of faith on the basis of attachment to primary converts. Now, the argument that Stark is going to make here is that a large source of secondary conversions, were husbands, right? We'll get to that argument in a sec, but that a lot of Christian women couldn't find Christian men to marry, so they married pagans, but with a sort of addendum, right? Like, okay, we can get married and, I will bear and raise your children, but they have to be raised Christian. And this eventually sort of leads to husbands, and because of the way Roman society is structured, whole households converting to Christianity, right? Because if your husband converts and you have slaves, well, those slaves just became Christian too, whether they like it or not. That's just how Roman society works. Right? So, and, same thing with, children, and often even, other relatives that you're in charge of. Okay, so primary and secondary conversion. Okay, so how are conversion and discovering and joining a religion different in this context? Right, so I guess in this context, right, conversion is the active choice to become a member after some period of evaluation, right? So typically people will maybe discover and sort of interact with other members of that religion, and then choose to convert. The discovery is the meeting of members, right? It's not, I guess it's a little bit different than the environment today where, say religions are easily discoverable by internet search, right? And you might try a bunch of different religions. Here, Stark is making the case it's principally by, you start forming social bonds with people who are part of that religion, and from there, you then sort of eventually discover that religion and become part of it. Okay. Yeah, so the plagues are not the main reason. It's just one factor amongst many, right? So, I mean, essentially the argument that Stark makes about the plagues is that what it does is it sort of shifts the ratio. Maybe I can just go, I know, I'm jumping. No, I can do that. Hang on. I'm going to answer one question at a time. Because I need, okay. So, this is basically, and I'll just re-explain this chart to answer that question, right? The idea here is essentially that, without the plagues, right? Christianity still would have grown considerably, right? And Stark uses this kind of hypothetical model, right? We have a city of 10,000 people, it's got 40 Christians, 9960 pagans. It's hit by plagues, right? So the population drops by 3,000. But because they're converting and surviving better, Christians actually, their number increases while the number of pagans decreases. And so once you go through that second plague, right, you have about a 1-to-4 ratio, right? 1 Christian for each 4 pagans, based on, higher survival rate and a continued kind of growth rate of 40% per decade. Without the plagues, right, he says it would have been like 1 in 8, right? Still 40% growth per decade, but without, kind of decreased pagan population and increased kind of link in social bonds. So it's not that the epidemics are the principal cause, they just kind of shift the ratio significantly in Christianity's favor. And I mean, what happens when a society goes from like, bless you, when you have a higher proportion of religious people, they become more obvious, right? And it becomes more kind of top of mind, essentially, right? Oh yeah, sorry, I had the assumptions. 30% mortality for those without nursing, 10% for those with nursing, and a continued 40% growth rate, right? So again, this is not super complicated or really a detailed model. It's more of a thought experiment, but suggesting that the plagues probably increased the proportion of Christians that were part of the population because the population shrank, but Christianity kept growing and it was more survivable. Okay, hopefully that helps. And now I must flash forward again. Okay. Okay. I'm not sure I understand that question. Okay. I will think about that as I answer this question. Okay, so primary conversion, right? Basically, primary conversion is where you as the convert, right, would decide, like take an active role, right? So you decide, you form social bonds, but you actively decide that I am going to convert to this religion because I have made an evaluation of the beliefs, right? And typically, and I want to be part of it, so I'm making a rational choice to be part of this religion. Okay, now that said, this is not done in a vacuum for Stark, right? Your interaction with other members of that religion play into that evaluation. Whereas secondary, it's like, okay, I'm attached to a primary convert, so I guess, I guess if the wife wants to go to church, I'll do that to make her happy, right? And that's the kind of, and you just kind of go and eventually you find that you've become, Christian in this particular argument. Hopefully that helps. So like just taking Judaism classes to convert be primary, or just learning any prescriptive teaching to convert. I assume if you're taking Judaism classes to convert, you definitely be doing something as a primary convert, right? Again, I suppose it depends, like, context probably matters here a little bit. So if you say, just suddenly found yourself unbelievably interested in Judaism, right? And you went and you took the classes to become Jewish, that would be primary conversion. Let's say on the other hand, though, that you were, you had met someone who's Jewish, right? A romantic partner of sorts, And in order to get married, right, you wanted to convert to Judaism, then I would put you more in the category of secondary convert. Here, typically, you're more doing it because of that, I guess that person not a convert, but that person being a believer in that religion, you're doing it more in a secondary fashion, right? Okay, hopefully that answers that question. Do they have to have been another religion to be part of this conversion process? Or just I'm not 100% sure what you were asking in this question. Do they have to be another religion to be part of this conversion process, or just living amongst said religion? Generally speaking, if we're talking about the ancient world, so Charlotte converting for Harry in Sex and the City is secondary. I'm going to have to take your word for it because I actually don't know anything about Sex and the City. Yeah, Maddie.
That is my question.
Okay.
I can explain it.
Yes.
I'm going into writing. So, say I was like Catholic or whatever, and I was also really interested in being Jewish.
Okay.
And so then I would convert to being Jewish. Is that the same as like if I was just like non-religious and I just started like hanging out with a bunch of like friends who are Christian or whatever? Okay, Christianity seems interesting, but like be Christian, but I had no religion prior.
I think that would both be the same. You'd still be like a primary convert, right? So yeah, if you had to, regardless of the starting point, because you're taking the kind of active role, like I'm going to seek this out and I'm going to do it, and it's not just because like, I'm with Tom and he's Jewish, so now I guess I have to be Jewish if we're going to be together. That's more kind of secondary conversion, right? So, or will be shunned from his family and that's too important to him, right? That would be more kind of secondary conversion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now you've tested my pop culture knowledge, and I have to admit I've never ever watched Sex and the City for more than about 5 minutes. So yes? All right. Okay. Where were we? Okay, we were here. So conversion, more common amongst women. I combined common and amongst to commonst. It's common amongst women, right? So this is sort of a relatively universal rule of conversion to new religious movements. Virtually all new religious movements at their start have more female converts than male ones, right? And yeah, all of our ancient and modern kind of sources, right? So New Testament, historians from the Roman period, and modern historians looking back, all kind of agree, right? Primary conversion to Christianity was more common amongst women. And this is super typical of our new religious movements, right? Example here, 75% of Christian scientists were women in the early days. Those sex ratios will tend to balance out over time. But yeah, we see this really commonly in cults, right? More women will join cults than men, especially in the early days. So it's really, really common. Okay, so from this, Stark says we can reasonably assume that somewhere around 2/3 of Christians were women, right, in the early days. Okay, so why does this matter? So he cites two kind of scholars of antiquity, right, Gutentag and Secord, who basically studied the status of women and compared it to sex ratios. And what they theorized, and the thing that Stark is going to kind of run with in his analysis, is that when males outnumbered females, women's rights actually get worse, right? Rather than being treated better because they're scarce goods, their roles are actually more enclosed, right? They're actually given less rights. And the opposite is true in antiquity. When females outnumber males, women will enjoy relatively greater power and freedom, right? So this doesn't hold through all of history. This is true, I think, just of antiquity. But in antiquity, right, this is the conclusion that Gutentag and Secord came to. And the example that they gave were Athens versus Sparta. And basically, Athens had a pretty skewed sex ratio, right? Athens, because the Athenians were pretty classically Greco-Roman, they basically tended to view women as lesser, and they had a strong kind of male, or like a boy preference in terms of babies. So if girls were born and the parents had been hoping for a boy, it's not altogether uncommon in Athens basically to expose those children to the elements and just try your luck again with the next one, as it were, right? So Sparta is a little bit different. The Spartans, I don't know if you've seen the movie 300, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Not, I guess, a great example of the Spartans, but they're a warrior culture. And the Spartans are philosophically quite different from the Athenians in the sense that what they care about is not sex ratio or boy versus girl. They care about health, right? So the Spartans, would basically keep any child, male or female, if it was healthy, right? Now the Spartans were brutal. If a child was deformed or sick, right, that child was probably going to be a victim of infanticide. But they didn't have a strong preference for boys over girls. And so Sparta's sex ratio is much more kind of 50-50, even with a bit of a surplus of women, because being a warrior culture, the men go off to war, and some of them die, leaving a surplus of women there. And so what do we see in Athens versus Sparta? Well, in Athens, women's rights are extremely constrained, right? Women can't hold property. There's tremendous pressure on them if their husband dies, right, to remarry and transfer that property to another man. Widows are not particularly taken care of. You have abortion, sex-selective infanticide, excuse me, and really, women's roles being quite constrained. Sparta, on the other hand, was a little bit more, I guess you would say, progressive in some sense. Women had a much more prominent role. They often ran the estates of their husbands when their husbands were off at war. And they had more rights to property if their husbands were killed in battle. It's, again, not egalitarian in the way that you would think, but Spartan women were treated much better than women in Athens. Okay, so from this, Stark basically draws one conclusion. If we have a surplus of Christian women in the Roman Empire should have higher status in their communities than their pagan counterparts. So, what do we find? Well, in Christian communities, right, there is no female infanticide, right? In fact, infanticide of any kind is not permitted to Christians, right? Very explicit religious rules ban infanticide, right? There's a really, really strong condemnation of divorce, incest, infidelity, and polygamy. And these would have all been things that afflicted women in major ways, right? Divorce being a really serious problem for women. One thing that we have to kind of remember is in late antiquity, from an economic perspective, women have very few options to support themselves, right? They're largely, not able to work, right? Largely constrained to the domestic sphere in most cases. They can't go to war. They largely can't own property. And, property is sort of the, like land, especially farmland, is the true source of wealth in the Roman Republic. So if your husband divorces you, right, as a woman, you are largely left destitute, right? So if some new prettier thing catches his eye, right, and he leaves you and divorces you, which was a relatively simple procedure in Roman law, you're sort of, you're either going to hopefully go back to your father, or hang out with one of your brothers, hopefully you have one, that's wealthy enough to support you. So it's a major problem. Okay, incest, I mean, I don't need to explain that one. Infidelity, especially as it leads to, divorce and wives being cast away, and polygamy, right? Polygamy, generally not a great social arrangement for women in general. So all of these things are explicitly banned in Christian communities. Now, technically speaking, in the early church, following kind of Jewish law, divorce was possible, right? So you could get divorced. It was doable, but it was really, really strongly discouraged. And by the time we reach the 3rd and 4th centuries, it's essentially explicitly banned, right? And you still see this, say, in Roman Catholicism. In Roman Catholicism, though, Catholicism has some technicalities that, you can play around with. It's not possible for people to get divorced, right? Like you can get divorced civilly, but you're still married religiously. So after that, you cannot get remarried. So, right, divorce really strongly discouraged at first until it's explicitly banned later on. Both Christian males and females are expected to be chaste, right? Which means to contain your sexual energy here within the marriage bond, right? So no premarital sex, no sex with prostitutes, none of that stuff. And this is important in the Roman context because Roman society was extremely unchaste, right? Especially for men. Women were largely expected to be virgins, when they were married, but men were largely, expected that they would be pretty wildly sexually active, as many girls as they could get, prostitutes, slaves, and such, as early, as quickly, and as much as they could get, which, again, not always a great circumstance for women when you're expected to be pure and the men aren't. Christianity sort of levels that playing field by saying all of you are expected to be chaste. So it balances out some of that, the requirement to be sexually controlled. Extramarital sex was condemned, right? So no sleeping with prostitutes, no premarital sex, none of those things, no mistresses, none of that. Again, things that in the ancient world put women at considerable risk. And widows were not pressured to remarry quickly, even slightly discouraged. And the church would, they were essentially allowed to continue holding their husband's property, not pressured to remarry and move that property onto another male, right? And the church, one of its early kind of selling points for a lot of people is that it supported poor widows, right? That widows could find succor and, both financial and material support from Christians. So women definitely treated better in kind of the Christian subculture in antiquity than they would have been in the main culture. Okay. Oh my goodness gracious. Is that more like it? I'm doing it because I wanna, and secondary, I will do it because of things I want. Yeah, I think that's, I guess things I want is more people I want, right? Typically, especially in the case that Stark is making, it's really about husbands kind of going along with their wives in this case, right? So yeah, typically that. So Bella converting to be a vampire for Edward would be secondary. I can't get into the Twilight novels. I'm sorry, I don't know. Anakin going to this dark side to save Padme is secondary. No, I think he's a primary convert to jerkiness and bad movie making. Okay, if women are more important in Christian conversion, how come there's not more prominent female figures in Christianity? Okay, that's a really interesting question. How to put this? I mean, it is still a deeply patriarchal culture that Christianity emerges into, right? It is not like, Christianity comes around and instantly erases all of prior history. Now that said, right, if you look at kind of the rank of saints, right, especially in Roman Catholicism, There are lots of saints who are women, right? There are very, very prominent female saints from antiquity through the Middle Ages, right? Catherine of Siena is the one that is sticking in my mind at the moment, right? So to say that there aren't really more prominent female figures in Christianity, I think at the end of the day, that statement is false. There's lots of prominent women. They're just not, they're not priests, right? Because Christianity has long held that women can't be priests. Again, well, Catholicism in particular, more kind of modern forms of Protestantism don't feel that way. But there are certainly a lot of prominent women in Christianity, right? They just aren't leaders in the same way, right? So I think the statement ultimately is not necessarily true. It just depends on the point of view that you're looking at it from, right? And we can certainly, and I'm trying to think of some, like, there's definitely saints female saints that were martyred and venerated early. I would just have to pick up my phone and look at it, and I'm in the middle of a lecture, so I can't do that. But there are certainly lots of prominent, Catholic saints and Orthodox saints from the 1st and 2nd centuries when the church was being particularly persecuted. Okay, oh, sorry. That's a good question. Okay, so antiquity. Oops, where is my pen? Okay, so antiquity, right? So this is what we would typically call like classical culture. So you probably put antiquity somewhere from around, 500 BC to, depends on who you talk to. 500 AD is probably a kind of good end point, right? So it's right about in there, and that's basically the end of the Western Roman Empire. It happens a couple of decades before 500 AD, but it's kind of what you would consider like, classical Greek and Roman dominated era of the Mediterranean, right? So yeah, that's what we mean when we say antiquity. I've seen some people, talk about like, late antiquity, going as far as say like 700 AD, and we're kind of blending in there to the Middle Ages, maybe 500 to 700. Specifically when people are talking about, say, the rise of Islam, Islam very specifically rises out of the sort of, not collapsing, but the damaged bodies of both the Persian and Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines, right? So I've heard people talk about, Islam emerging in late antiquity, but I will tend to say, like, for me, antiquity ends with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, so right around 500 AD, right? So I think 473 is the final year of the western part of the Roman Empire, when the last Roman emperor hanging out, not even in Rome, but in Ravenna, gets told by the local Germanic warlord that, dude, you're out of a job. Okay, I think I answered both these questions. These are both good questions. Okay, so now I must clear this, or I have written ugly things on my slide. Okay, so one of the other claims that Stark makes, and again, good historical evidence for this, was that Christian girls tended to get married a little bit later, right? Now, we don't obviously have exact statistics. We just have, kind of scattered records showing like the ages of people when they got married, in things like church records, in some kind of Roman, Roman documents that still survive. Now, when it comes to marriage, right, Roman culture, being a culture of antiquity, is kind of gross, right? Again, girls and women were often sort of disposed of for economic and political reasons. So you might very well marry off your daughter to someone, not so much, Romeo and Juliet, more, hey, this person is an economic burden to me and I want to make an alliance with you. So it was not uncommon, for girls, to be married off to people at very young ages, right? Now, under Roman law, the minimum age for marriage for a girl was 12, but it was not uncommon for girls to be essentially married off to men. And I believe, again, if I remember Julius Caesar and his wife, who I think was named Julia, she was married, essentially, I think at around 9 or 10, right, off to Julius Caesar to secure that alliance. But yeah, marriage of your daughter before 12 carried no legal penalty. And basically, you could be, if you got married before 12, you became a legitimate wife once you turned 12. And because the Romans just like to have sex with everything, and this is one of their defining kind of features, even under marriages to underage brides were often consummated, right? So they would have sex with the young girl, even though she had not hit puberty yet. So early Epstein, if you catch my meaning, right? And I just want to stress that I have the word ew here because it's yucky. Now, generally speaking, right, again, Christians don't disappear entirely from this culture, but a slightly higher percentage of them would have been married later, right? So more of them would have been married in the 15 to 17 or 18 plus kind of range. And I mean, I've seen estimates that suggest that the average age at which a kind of Christian girl got married in this period was probably somewhere between 17 and 19, right? That's probably pretty average on the whole. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why this is super important, right? Even from just a health perspective. The further you are along in kind of development, the more likely you are to survive things like childbirth, right? 14-year-olds that get pregnant, have a much higher chance of complications from pregnancy than 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, right? And older, right? So this likely also kind of helps, increase Christian fertility numbers because you're moving more Christian girls getting married to a little bit later when they're a little bit better developed. And often, right, it's something that is seen more as a choice in Christian communities. By the time we reach kind of the 8th century in Western Christianity, it gets elevated to marriage gets elevated to a sacrament in Western Christianity, and then it has to be something that both parties positively consent to, but that comes a little bit later. Okay, so some contradictory evidence, which Stark really sort of admits here. The New Testament is not altogether, friendly to women either. Again, coming out of a patriarchal culture, here we have Paul, and this is very famously, been used even in sort of modern context to argue that women shouldn't be allowed to pastor churches. Women should remain silent in churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. Now, I mean, I've heard some, Christian apologists, which I'm not among them, argue that what Paul is doing here is he's actually sort of making fun of this, right? He's actually sort of, this is what people say, but this is why it's not right. But it's certainly been used in the opposite way. But here's, our positive commendation of Phoebe, right? I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in wherever that is, Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and blah, 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 right? Greet Priscilla and Aquila, two other women, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, right? So they risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them, right? So in this, in two different kind of letters, Paul seems to have two different views on women. One very laudatory and lauding these women, calling Phoebe a deacon, right? And the other being like, yeah, shut up, don't talk. So at best, the evidence of the role of women, in terms of philosophically, is a bit contradictory in the New Testament. That said, it does seem that women played some early leadership role in the church, right? Paul calls Priscilla and Aquila co-workers in Christ Jesus, and Phoebe a deacon, but it's not quite clear how much of one, and there's still raging debates in Christian communities what Phoebe's role as a deacon actually was. And we know, for instance, oh man, I could give you so much history and I don't know if I should. I will. In the Middle Ages, in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, they did have deaconesses, and they were specifically there to baptize women. Why? Well, because in the early kind of rite of baptism, it involved stripping down completely naked and fully immersing yourself in the baptismal font, and it was seen as unseemly for a man, to be the one dipping a naked woman underwater. So we had deaconesses do that instead. So there you go. Okay. Now that said, here citing Thurston, women made up a high proportion of Christian martyrs, which does seem to suggest that they had important positions in the church. If the Romans were trying to stamp out your religion, they're probably not going to go after the run-of-the-mill person. They're trying to send messages, so they're crucifying prominent members, right? Or throwing them to the lions, as it were. Oh, good, no questions. Perfect. Okay. How am I doing for time? I have absolutely no idea. And, Erica is here. How are we doing, Erica? Okay. Because, it's too early to stop, but 10 or 12 more minutes. Okay. I feels ya. There we go. Now I have a clock. Oh, the Eye of Sauron returns. Okay. I really hate this new logo. I wish it wasn't here. I can see it on my screen. You can't see it. It just stares at me soullessly and darkly. Okay. So, now, simple math, right? If 2/3 of Christians were women, this automatically makes it difficult for them to marry Christian men, right? There simply aren't enough Christian men. And this, as Stark points out, and I think this is correct, would have been an especially big problem for high status women, right? There is no marrying down in social class in Roman society. If you marry down in social class, right, you lose the privileges of your class. And it is a very class stratified society, and nobody has time for that, right? So the evidence suggests that basically what Christian women did is they married, the evidence suggests they married, or the oversupply of women wouldn't have been useful, rather it would have been detrimental to Christianity, right? So Christianity does well. So this will mean that these Christian women were able to marry and have Christian children, right? And so basically what they did was they found eligible pagan men, and as you probably remember from a few slides ago, there's a surplus of women, there's a lack of women in Roman society. So, a woman to marry, especially one from a nice family, would be, a commodity worth having. So, what did they do? They got married. They got married to pagan men, but they would have insisted on raising any children as Christians, right? And if you, ever were to see, say, a marriage between, say, a Catholic and a non-Catholic, right? This is still part of the Catholic rite of marriage. And I can't remember the exact wording. I should look it up. But basically, you have to agree as part of the Catholic rite of marriage, right? So the thing you do in front of the church, you will raise any children that come out of it as Catholics, right? So still a practice in the Catholic rite of marriage. All right. And historians find lots of evidence of secondary conversion of husbands, and therefore of their households as well, because of their Christian wives, right? And so what we see, and we'll often see this in kind of historical documents, is like, okay, the household of, Severus. That's actually just a person from Harry Potter, but I couldn't think of a Romany type sounding name, so Severus it is. Maximus, let's say Maximus, right? Converted to Christianity on this date, right? And all his slaves and all his servants and blah, 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 right? But that largely was probably driven by women. Okay. So, Rome. Again, we maybe kind of think this is funny, given the lack of contraception. But Rome frequently struggled with population stagnations and declines. And it was pretty typical, especially in citizen families that held land, that they actually wanted relatively small families of 2 or 3 at most. And they have pretty high mortality, right? So this is really, really bad for an empire that wants to constantly be expanding, right? The Roman Empire was kind of a pretty constantly expansionistic one, and one that at times got itself into all sorts of trouble for expanding further than its population could handle, right? This region in particular was especially nasty because there were lots of Germanic tribes over here that tended to want to invade, and that little bubble right there caused the Romans no end of trouble trying to defend it. They tried all sorts of things, right? And this is why, interestingly, like lots of places today have fertility struggles, and lots of places have tried paying parents to have more children, and it never works. And it didn't work for the Romans either, right? They had what you could kind of glibly call a land for babies program, right? If your family was 5 or 6, right, you would be granted an extra plot of land. But this didn't really work, right? Because having children is apparently harder than being wealthier by having more land, right? And people didn't want it. Culture plays a role. So what the Romans ended up having to do in a lot of cases is import populations from amongst various non-Roman peoples. And yeah, this eventually becomes a serious problem that will contribute to the collapse of the Western Empire in 476, because they're never able to fully Romanize the Germanics up here, right? So they import a bunch of Germanics, and those Germanics learn the Roman way of war, and then basically spend the best part of the 5th century running around Italy and the rest of the Roman Empire, taking everything they want, and sort of sacking Rome 2-3 times. Okay, so why did the pagans, right? Why did the Romans have such low fertility? So for men, marriage was held in relatively low esteem, and men didn't have to get married to have sex, right? They're not chaste. There's no expectation of premarital virtue. Right, men would delay marriage. They'd have their good times. Try to get with as many women as possible and some prostitutes and all of that, right? There's no connection of sex to marriage, so the incentive is inherently not there. Okay, infanticide, right? They tended to want to keep families small and male-dominated, right? And Stark cites this letter in there, and I can't remember, I want to say it's from Seneca, right? Writing home to his wife who's about to have a baby, and he's like, if it is a boy, name it after me and care for it, and if it is a girl, bash it against a rock or something, the equivalent of it, right? Like women are worthless in that sense, right? So yeah, there's no moral prohibition on the killing of unwanted children, right? This is common in Roman society. And actually, some, like Seneca, thought of it as a moral duty. Mostly, female infants were killed and males with birth defects, right? Male children were prized, female children were a kind of economic liability because they would be sort of, I guess, something you had to support until you were able to sort of essentially sell them off to another family, to put it crudely. And yeah, abortion, lots of techniques. The Romans had lots of ways of doing abortions, including, copper tools that were inserted, about where you'd think. It killed many children, and it also killed many women, right, for a couple of reasons, right? Infections, fetuses not being expelled because of a failed or because of a pharmaceutical abortion, and then women, ingesting a, non-fatal dose of poison and accidentally poisoning themselves and dying, right? So, yeah, all of that stuff. And then the Romans, actually practice a whole bunch of different forms of birth control, crude methods that were, often curiously effective as well. So ointments, honey, pads of soft wool, inserted, I guess, the less detail given, the better. Withdrawal, right? So, again, the less detail given, the better. And a common Roman practice amongst couples who didn't want to get pregnant of playing the boy, or what you might call anal, right? So there you go. Don't stick it in the right place, you don't get babies. There you go. And of course, just too few women as part of Roman society, which meant not every man could find, a wife to bear his children. Okay. Oh, that's an interesting question. It's not altogether off topic. I'm looking at Erica. Are we doing for time? Can I answer this question? Okay, good. Just have to check with Erica, right? She's the timekeeper. Well, I mean, if you stick it somewhere, it might block the sperm. That's, soak a wool pad in it and shove it up there. You might not get pregnant. So there you go. I said crude, but at times curiously effective. And you asked for details, so you got it. You're welcome. Okay, this is an interesting question. So this really changes in the Middle Ages, right? I know. I'm almost done, the rise of women or the role of women, so we'll finish that and then we'll stop. Okay, but I'll answer this question, right? So this really rebalances during the Middle Ages, right? And in the Middle Ages, Christianity doesn't just become the dominant religion, it essentially becomes the religion, and a lot of this shifts sideways, right? So for one, you get the establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. I can't remember. Edict of Milan is where it's tolerated is 313. I can't remember the date where it becomes the official one. It's in the 350s. I just can't remember the exact year. Right? It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then things really change. And a lot of the, and this is one of Stark's criticism of establishment, is that a lot of this energy that prior, had been sort of directed at converts, creating better conditions for women, kind of dissipates as it becomes the official religion, right? And then it just kind of, the ratio just kind of rebalances. So history kind of intervenes here. Now that said, until really recently, and maybe we'll talk about this in our religious landscape stuff a little bit later in the course, women have consistently been more religious than men and made up a higher proportion of church goers. Weirdly, this looks like it's changing, but again, that is a horse of a different color and a story for a whole different unit, which we will talk about later on. Okay, my last slide here. So, high Christian fertility, right? The ancients take this as they take it for granted, right? Christians, really prize marriage, and they have what's called a sanctified marriage bond, right? It becomes part of, the religious ceremony. The weird way that Christians conceive of even the church's own relationship with Jesus is that he's the bridegroom, right? So he's the groom, and the church itself is the bride. And so in marriage, they see something of a reflection of that relationship. So your relationship with your husband or wife is a reflection of the relationship that God has with the church, right? So it's highly sanctified, and it is very much the way of, controlling and legitimizing the sexual desire, right? Paul tells, in Corinthians, he's like, look, if you burn, right, better to get married, right? He's like, you shouldn't get married if you don't have to, because Jesus is coming back any minute now. But if you've got the itch, not talking about an STI here, the itch to have sex, you're better to get married and do it that way, right? So it's sanctified in Christianity. So you have strong kind of family protections for children. And yeah, no abortion or infanticide is allowed. And this goes back to Judaism. Judaism is the same here. Wow, that's wonderful writing on my part. Judaism also doesn't allow abortion or infanticide, nor does Judaism allow most methods of birth control, including things like withdrawal, right? So you have lots of women, lots of fertile women, no abortion, no birth control, and a strong kind of family structure. And what you get out of that is really high Christian fertility. So what does that do, right? Your women, right? You're drawing a lot of women in, you're converting them, and then those women have a whole bunch of children that themselves become Christian, and over time, the wave kind of builds, right? And that's what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to check one more time for questions. Make a lot of friends and have a lot of babies. No cults are coming out of this class, bro. Okay, I'm good with that. I don't want cults. Cults are bad. Make a lot of friends. I mean, why wouldn't you want to make a lot of friends? All right, we'll see you on Thursday. We'll finish up and we'll talk midterm. Okay, I hope, maybe.